January 12, 1944, the coldest winter Texas had seen in half a century. Across America, German prisoners of war were being distributed to camps far from the coasts, far from any possibility of escape or sabotage. In facilities from Louisiana to Oklahoma, male POWs settled into the strange reality of captivity on foreign soil. But in a hastily constructed compound outside Fort Stockton, Texas, something unusual was happening. When the transport truck rolled through the gates, carrying its cargo of 53 German women prisoners, the guards standing watch felt the wind cut through their winter coats and wondered how these enemy soldiers would survive what was coming. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance through Italy and North Africa. Young women who had served the Reich as clerks, radio operators, nurses, and administrators, now facing a Texas winter in a camp designed for summer occupation. What could possibly drive human beings to build ovens from mud and hope in the frozen wasteland of West Texas? Before we discover how these remarkable women survived, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 3 hours earlier, on that transport truck, when the women first understood what kind of place they were being taken to. Clara Schultz, 28 years old and formerly an administrative clerk from Bavaria, pressed her face against the small window and watched the landscape transform from something resembling civilization to an endless expanse of nothing. The towns grew smaller and farther apart until there were no towns at all, just flat scrubland stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Beside her, 22-year-old Inge Hoffman shivered despite the 3 layers of clothing she wore. The truck's canvas covering did little to block the wind that howled across the open plains. She had been a radio operator in North Africa, accustomed to heat and sand, not this bone-deep cold that seemed to penetrate straight to the marrow. Frau Kraus, at 42, the oldest among them, sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the dignity she had carried through 3 months of captivity. She had been a nurse and refused to show these American guards any sign of fear or discomfort. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas flap was pulled back, the women stepped down into a world that seemed designed to break them. The camp consisted of 6 wooden barracks, arranged in 2 rows, surrounded by barbed wire fencing. There were no trees, no windbreaks, nothing but flat land and sky. The wind hit them like a physical force. Lieutenant Rebecca Coleman stood waiting, her coat wrapped tight. She was 26, from Massachusetts, and had requested this assignment thinking it would be easier than working with male prisoners. Now she wasn't so sure. The first night in the Respot, the Actaspi barracks revealed just how unprepared the camp was for winter. The wooden structures had been hastily constructed during the previous summer, designed for the scorching Texas heat rather than the brutal cold that now gripped West Texas. Gaps between the wall planks allowed wind to whistle through, and the single potbelly stove at the center of each barracks struggled to heat the cavernous space that housed 18 women. Clara lay on her thin mattress, wrapped in 2 blankets that felt no thicker than bed sheets, and listened to the wind howl outside. Around her, she could hear the other women shifting restlessly, unable to sleep despite their exhaustion from the long journey. Some whispered in German, their voices carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing fear about what they had gotten themselves into. By morning, young Anna Weber was running a fever. Frau Kraus examined her with the clinical efficiency of her nursing training, but her expression betrayed her concern. The girl's lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she couldn't stop shivering even when the other women piled their own blankets on top of her. Lieutenant Coleman was summoned, and she returned an hour later with a military doctor who prescribed rest and warmth, as if either were readily available in this frozen wasteland. The women maintained their military bearing during the first days, standing at attention during roll call, moving in formation to the mess hall, speaking only when spoken to. They were German soldiers, or had been, and they would not give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them break. But pride couldn't keep their fingers from going numb during outdoor work assignments. Pride couldn't stop their teeth from chattering through the night. Pride couldn't prevent frostbite from creeping into their toes, despite the extra socks Corporal Ruth Davidson quietly distributed. Inge watched Clara during those early days and noticed something that the others seemed to miss. While the asked feed fast, the rest of them focused on enduring each moment. Clara was studying their surroundings with an intensity that suggested she was looking for something specific. During their brief outdoor periods, Clara would crouch down and dig her fingers into the earth, examining the soil with the same attention she had once given to administrative documents. On the fourth night, when Anna's condition worsened and two other women began showing signs of illness, something shifted in the barracks. Frau Kraus, who had maintained her rigid dignity throughout their captivity, sat down heavily on her bunk and put her face in her hands. It was the first crack in her armor, and it sent a ripple of fear through the other women. If Frau Kraus was losing hope, what chance did the rest of them have? That was when Clara spoke up, her voice cutting through the despair that had settled over them like the cold itself. She told them about her father's bakery in Bavaria, about the massive brick oven he had built with his own hands when money was too scarce to buy one. She told them about mud and clay and fire. Clara's words hung in the cold air of the barracks like an impossible promise. The women stared at her as if she had suggested they could fly home to Germany by flapping their arms. Build an oven? Here? From mud? It seemed like the desperate fantasy of someone whose mind had been broken by captivity and cold. But Clara continued speaking, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if what she was proposing made perfect sense. She explained how her father had mixed clay-rich soil with water and straw, how he had shaped it into a dome over a wooden frame, how he had let it dry in the sun before carefully burning out the frame and firing the clay until it hardened. She described the heat that oven had produced, how it had warmed their entire bakery during Bavarian winters, how bread baked in it had a crust and flavor that no modern oven could match. Inge was the first to break the silence. "But we're prisoners," she said quietly. "The Americans will never let us build fires outside. They'll think we're trying to signal someone or escape." Her practical objection voiced what several others were thinking, but it also revealed something else. She hadn't said the idea was impossible, only that permission would be impossible. Frau Kraus lifted her head from her hands and looked at Clara with an expression that mixed skepticism with desperate hope. "Even if they allowed it," she said, "do you actually remember how to build such a thing? You were a child watching your father work, not an apprentice learning a trade." It was a fair question, and everyone waited for Clara's answer. Clara met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "I was 11 years old when my father built that oven," she replied. "Old enough to mix mud, to carry stones, to watch every step of the process. I helped him rebuild it twice after the clay cracked from the heat." "Yes, Frau Kraus, I remember." She paused, then added more softly, "And what choice do we have? Anna is getting worse. The cold is killing us as surely as any bullet would. We can maintain our dignity and freeze to death, or we can dig in the mud like peasants and survive." The harsh truth of her words settled over the group. They had all felt it, the way the cold was draining their strength day by day, turning their thoughts sluggish and their movements stiff. They had all seen how Anna's condition was deteriorating despite Frau Kraus's best efforts. They were dying slowly, with military bearing and proper discipline, but dying nonetheless. Helga Steinberg, the former factory supervisor who had been skeptical of everything since their capture, spoke up from her corner bunk. "I worked with clay before the war," she said gruffly, "in the ceramics factory in Dresden. If you truly know how to shape an oven, I can help reinforce the structure. But we'll need the Americans' cooperation, and I don't see why they would give." The next morning, Clara approached Lieutenant Coleman during the breakfast distribution. The other women watched from their table as Clara stood before the young American officer, speaking in her careful, accented English. They couldn't hear the conversation over the clatter of metal trays and the general noise of the mess hall, but they could see Lieutenant Coleman's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been cautious interest. Sergeant James Hartwell, who had been standing nearby, burst out laughing when he overheard the request. "Ma'am, are you seriously considering letting these Krauts build ovens?" He emphasized the word with deliberate mockery. "What's next? Gonna let them forge weapons from scrap metal? Maybe build a nice little radio transmitter while they're at it?" Several other guards joined in his laughter, and Clara felt her face flush with humiliation. But Lieutenant Coleman didn't laugh. She studied Clara's face for a long moment, then glanced over at the table where Anna Weber sat, barely touching her food, her skin still carrying that worrisome bluish tint. The camp doctor had visited again that morning and had pulled Coleman aside to warn her that pneumonia was a very real possibility if conditions didn't improve. The portable heaters that had been promised were delayed indefinitely due to shipping priorities for the war effort. "Show me," Lieutenant Coleman said finally. "Show me exactly what you want to build and where you want to build it. If it seems remotely feasible and safe, I'll take it to Captain Foster." The mess hall had gone quieter, and now everyone was watching the exchange. Clara nodded once, sharply, maintaining her composure despite the sergeant's continued smirking. That afternoon, Clara led Lieutenant Coleman to a spot just outside the barracks, close enough to provide warmth but far enough from the wooden structures to avoid fire danger. She knelt in the frozen earth and began to dig with her bare hands, showing the lieutenant the composition of the soil. It was heavy with clay, the same reddish-brown earth that covered everything in West Texas. She explained, through gestures and halting English, how they would need water, straw from the horse stables, and stones from the surrounding area. Sergeant Hartwell had followed them, along with Private Marcus Chen and several other guards who seemed curious despite their skepticism. "This is insane," Hartwell muttered, but he was watching Clara's hands as she shaped a small sample of mud mixed with bits of dried grass. "Even if you could build it, the first fire would crack it apart. Clay needs to be fired properly, in a kiln, not just dried in the sun." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself a small smile. "You are from Texas, yes?" she asked. When he nodded, she continued, "Then you know the earth here, hard like stone when it dries. Your ancestors, the natives, they built homes from this mud that stood for generations." Captain Foster approved the project with one condition. The women would have 3 days to build a functioning oven, and if it failed or posed any safety risk, the experiment would end immediately. Lieutenant Coleman delivered this news to the barracks that evening, and the women responded with a mixture of relief and terror. 3 days wasn't much time, but it was more than they had dared hope for. Work began at dawn the next morning. Clara divided the women into teams based on their strengths and abilities. The younger, stronger women were assigned to dig and carry soil from the clay-rich deposit she had identified. Others hauled water from the camp well in buckets, while Frau Kraus and the women too ill to do heavy labor picked through the refuse pile for anything useful, finding scraps of wire, broken tools, and fragments of wood. Helga took charge of mixing the mud, adding precise amounts of water to the clay soil and working it with her hands until the consistency was right. She had Ing gather straw from the stables, which Private Chen helped them access without asking too many questions. The straw was mixed into the mud to provide structure, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. The mixture had to be perfect. Too wet, and it would collapse. Too dry, and it would crumble. Sergeant Hartwell watched from a distance, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure. But as the day progressed, his expression began to change. The women worked with an efficiency that surprised him, moving in coordinated teams, communicating in rapid German, punctuated by the occasional English word they had learned. They weren't playing at construction. They were building something with purpose and skill. By the end of the first day, they had created a foundation of stones and packed earth. By the end of the second day, the dome structure was taking shape, built up layer by layer around a wooden frame they had, fashioned from crates. The shape was crude but recognizable, a beehive-like structure about 4 feet high with an opening at the front and a small chimney hole at the top. On the morning of the third day, as the Texas sun finally emerged from behind winter clouds, they carefully dismantled the wooden frame from inside, leaving the hollow clay shell to continue drying. The afternoon sun helped cure the outside, and by evening, the moment of truth had arrived. The women gathered around their creation, and even the guards who had mocked them stood watching with unexpected anticipation. Clara knelt before the opening with a handful of kindling and a match that Private Chen had provided. Her hands shook slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what failure would mean. She struck the match and touched it to the kindling. The small flame caught, grew, and began to spread. Slowly, carefully, she added larger pieces of wood, feeding the fire while watching the clay dome for any signs of cracking. Smoke rose through the chimney hole. Heat began to radiate from the opening. The clay held. The oven's success changed everything overnight. What had been an experiment born of desperation became the focal point of the entire camp. The women took turns feeding the fire through that first night, keeping it burning low and steady to cure the clay from the inside. By morning, the oven had proven itself capable of holding heat for hours, radiating warmth that could be felt from 10 feet away. But Clara had a vision that went beyond mere warmth. On the fourth morning, she approached Lieutenant Coleman with another request, this time asking for flour, salt, and yeast from the camp stores. The lieutenant understood immediately what Clara intended, and despite regulations about prisoner rations, she approved a small allocation. If these women could build an oven from mud, she wanted to see if they could actually bake in it. The women pooled their meager resources. Frau Kraus contributed a small tin of lard she had been saving. Inja offered precious sugar from her Red Cross package. Helga produced salt she had smuggled from the mess hall over several days. Together, they had barely enough ingredients for 2 small loaves, but it would have to be sufficient. Clara mixed the dough with the same careful attention her father had taught her, kneading it on a board that Private Chen had cleaned and brought from the carpentry shop. The dough rose slowly in the cold air, covered with a cloth near the oven's warmth. The women went about their assigned duties that day, but their thoughts remained with that rising dough, with the promise it represented. This wasn't just about food or warmth anymore. It was about reclaiming something human, something that transcended their status as prisoners and enemies. Bread was civilization. Bread was home. Bread was the difference between surviving and living. When Clara finally slid the loaves into the oven that evening, using a celled, makeshift peel fashioned from a wooden plank, a crowd had gathered. Not just the German women, but American guards as well, drawn by curiosity and by the aroma that had begun to fill the compound. Even Sergeant Hartwell stood watching, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching respect. The smell that emerged from that mud oven was extraordinary. It drifted across the barracks, through the guard stations, all the way to the administration building where Captain Foster sat at his desk. It was the smell of yeast and heat and transformation, the smell of grain becoming sustenance, the smell that had drawn humans to fire and community since the beginning of civilization. Several of the German women began to cry, not from sadness but from the overwhelming rush of memory that scent triggered. It was the smell of their mothers' kitchens, of bakeries in their hometowns, of Saturday mornings and Christmas Eves and everything they had lost. When Clara pulled the loaves from the oven, they were imperfect. The crust was uneven, darker in some places than others. The shape was rustic and irregular, but they were bread, real bread, and they were beautiful. Clara broke the first loaf with her hands, the crust crackling in a way that sent a shiver through the assembled women. She gave the first piece to Anna Weber, whose fever had finally broken 2 days earlier. The girl bit into the warm bread and closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. Clara distributed pieces to every woman in the barracks, ensuring each received an equal share. The portions were small, barely more than a mouthful, but no one complained. They savored each bite as if it were the finest delicacy. What happened next surprised everyone, including Clara herself. She approached Sergeant Hartwell, who stood at the edge of the gathering, and offered him a piece of the second loaf. He stared at her extended hand for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The other guards watched, uncertain how their sergeant would respond to this gesture from an enemy prisoner. Finally, he reached out and accepted the bread, nodding once in acknowledgement. "It's good," he said simply, and though his voice was gruff, there was no mockery in it. He turned to Private Chen and the other guards. She wasn't lying about knowing how to bake. It was as close to an apology as his pride would allow, but the women understood the significance. They had proven themselves as something more than enemy soldiers or helpless prisoners. They had demonstrated skill, resourcefulness, and a generosity that transcended the boundaries of war. Over the following days, something remarkable began to happen. Sergeant Hartwell, who had been their harshest skeptic, started bringing materials to improve the oven. He showed up one morning with fire bricks salvaged from a demolished building in town, explaining in his rough manner that they would help the oven retain heat more efficiently. He demonstrated how to bank the coals at night to keep embers alive until morning, sharing knowledge passed down from his grandfather who had worked as a railroad cook. Private Chen contributed scraps of metal that could be fashioned into better tools for tending the fire. Corporal Davidson brought a thermometer from the medical supplies so they could monitor the oven's temperature. Even Lieutenant Coleman began stopping by in the evenings to check on the oven's progress, offering suggestions and quietly approving additional fuel allotments that went slightly beyond regulation limits. The women built 2 more ovens over the next week, each one an improvement on the last. They refined their technique, learning from mistakes and incorporating the advice the guards provided. Inga discovered she had a talent for shaping the domes, creating structures that were not just functional but aesthetically pleasing. Helga developed a method for reinforcing weak spots with extra layers of clay mixed with ash from the fires, which created a stronger bond. The ovens became gathering places in the compound. Even during the coldest evenings, women would cluster around them, warming their hands and sharing stories in mixed German and English. The Americans began teaching them new words, and the German women reciprocated with phrases from their own language. Sergeant Hartwell learned to say Guten Morgen with a passable accent. Clara discovered she could make the guards laugh with her mispronunciations of Texas slang. By February, the camp had transformed into something that resembled a small village more than a prison facility. 5 ovens now dotted the compound, each one tended by a different group of women who had developed their own techniques and schedules. The ovens served different purposes. Some were kept burning constantly for warmth, others were fired only when baking, and one was designated specifically for drying clothes and equipment. The women had learned to read the clay, understanding when it needed repair, when it required rest, and when it could be pushed to produce maximum heat. But the ovens had taught them lessons that went far beyond construction and fire management. They had learned that survival required cooperation across boundaries they had once considered absolute. Frau Kraus, who had initially resisted the oven project as beneath their dignity, now spent her evenings teaching younger women the medicinal properties of herbs that could be baked into healing teas. She worked alongside Corporal Davidson, sharing knowledge that transcended nationality and allegiance. Between them, they had created a system of care that had kept every woman in the camp alive through the worst of winter. Helga had discovered that her factory supervisory skills translated well to managing the complex schedule of oven usage. She created a rotation system that ensured fair access while maximizing efficiency, mediating disputes with the same firm fairness she had once used on the ceramics production line in Dresden. She found herself working closely with Private Tommy Sullivan, who had proven surprisingly adept at scrounging materials the women needed. Together, they developed a barter system. The women mended uniforms and knitted scarves for the guards, in exchange for wood scraps, clay, and other supplies. Ing had become the camp's unofficial chronicler, sketching the ovens and the daily life around them in a notebook that Lieutenant Coleman had provided. Her drawings captured moments of unexpected beauty. Women silhouetted against firelight, smoke rising into winter sky, hands kneading dough or shaping clay. She showed her sketches to Private Chen one evening, and he shared that his mother had been an artist in China before immigrating to America. They began having conversations about art and memory, about how creativity survived even in the hardest circumstances. The ovens had also revealed something uncomfortable about identity and loyalty. Clara found herself thinking less often about Germany and more about the community they were building in this unlikely place. She still considered herself German, still spoke her native language with the other women, but the sharp edges of nationalism had softened into something more complex. When news of Allied bombing raids on German cities reached the camp, she felt grief for her homeland, but also understanding for why such measures might be necessary. The moral certainties she had once held were crumbling like dried clay, being reformed into shapes she didn't yet fully recognize. One evening, as she tended the main oven, Sergeant Hartwell sat down beside her on the log bench the women had constructed. "You know what I can't figure out?" he said, staring into the flames, "is how you folks went from being our enemies to being just people so damn fast." He glanced at her. "Or maybe you were always just people, and I was too stubborn to see it." March brought the first hints of warmth to West Texas. The first fever, brutal cold that had defined their winter began to retreat, replaced by days when the sun actually felt pleasant rather than merely less hostile. The women no longer woke to find frost on the inside of the barracks windows. Anna Weber, who had nearly died in January, now walked the compound without assistance, her cheeks regaining color that had nothing to do with fever. Logic suggested that the ovens would become less important as temperatures rose. They had been built out of necessity, tools for survival that would naturally fade in relevance once the threat had passed. But something unexpected happened instead. The women continued to fire the ovens daily, continued to gather around them in the evenings, continued to bake bread, even though warmth was no longer a matter of life and death. Lieutenant Coleman noticed this shift and found it curious enough to mention in her weekly report to Captain Foster. The German prisoners maintain their ovens despite improved weather conditions, she wrote. The structures appear to have taken on significance beyond their practical function. She struggled to articulate what she observed in the women's faces as they tended their fires, the way their entire bearing had changed since that desperate January morning when Clara had first proposed the impossible. The ovens had become something more than survival tools. They were proof of what the women had accomplished, tangible evidence that they were more than passive victims of circumstance. Every loaf of bread that emerged from those mud domes was a small act of defiance against despair, a declaration that they retained agency over at least this small portion of their lives. The ovens represented dignity reclaimed through labor and skill. Inge's sketches from this period showed the evolution clearly. Her January drawings depicted hunched figures desperately seeking warmth, faces shadowed with fear and exhaustion. Her March sketches showed women standing straighter, smiling as they worked, their body language transformed from mere endurance to something approaching purpose. She had captured the moment when survival had shifted into living. The American guards noticed the change as well. Sergeant Hartwell, who had spent months observing these women, remarked to Private Chen that the prisoners no longer moved like defeated soldiers. They walk like they're part of something, he said, unable to quite name what that something was. The Germans still lined up for roll call, still followed camp regulations, still wore the marks of their prisoner status. But within those constraints, they had created a community that felt less like captivity and more like a strange kind of home. Frau Krause, sitting beside one of the ovens on a mild evening, explained it to Lieutenant Coleman in her careful English. In Germany, we lost everything, she said. Our homes, our families, our understanding of who we were and what we believed. Here, in this place that was supposed to break us, we built something with our own hands. These ovens, they are ours, not because we own them, but because we created them. Do you understand the difference? Lieutenant Coleman nodded slowly. She understood more than Frau Krause might have expected. She had watched these women transform from broken prisoners into builders, from enemies into simply human beings trying to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. News reached the Texas camp 3 days later, arriving with the usual military dispatches but carrying unprecedented weight. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that these women had served no longer existed. Their homeland had been divided, occupied, transformed into something none of them would recognize. The question of repatriation, which had seemed straightforward months earlier, now became impossibly complex. The women gathered around the ovens that evening, not for warmth or for baking, but because these structures had become their anchor in a world that had shifted beneath their feet once again. They spoke in quiet German, processing what the end of the war meant for their futures. Some had received letters through the Red Cross, confirming that their families were alive. Others had heard nothing for months and faced the terrifying possibility of returning to a country where no one waited for them. Clara stood before the first oven they had built, the one that had proven mud and hope could sustain life through the coldest winter. She ran her hand along its surface, feeling the rough clay that had been shaped by dozens of hands working in desperate cooperation. This structure would outlast their time here, she realized. Long after they were gone, this oven would remain, slowly weathering back into the earth from which it came. Lieutenant Coleman approached with the official repatriation orders. The women would be processed for return to Germany within 6 weeks, transported to camps in Europe where they would await final placement in the occupied zones. It was the ending they had always known would come, yet now that it had arrived, it felt less like liberation and more like another form of loss. What will happen to the ovens? Ing asked quietly. It seemed like a small question compared to the magnitude of their uncertain futures, but everyone waited for the answer as if it mattered more than anything else. They'll remain, Lieutenant Coleman said. Captain Foster has decided they're to be preserved as part of the camp's history. Whatever comes next for this facility, your ovens will stay. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Proof that they had existed here, that they had created, rather than merely endured. The 6 weeks passed in a strange suspension between past and future. The women continued to bake, to tend their fires, to maintain the community they had built around these mud structures. American guards, who had once mocked them, now helped repair cracks in the clay, extending the life of ovens that would soon lose their keepers. Private Chen brought Inge extra paper for her sketches, wanting her to document everything before they left. Sergeant Hartwell taught Clara a recipe for sourdough starter that could survive long journeys, a gift disguised as practical information. On the final morning, the women stood in formation for the last time, but before boarding the transport trucks, they made one final request. They wanted to fire all 5 ovens simultaneously, one last time. Captain Foster granted permission, and as smoke rose from each chimney, the women stood together watching what they had built from desperation and mud continue to function exactly as designed. Years later, long after the camp had been decommissioned and the barracks had been dismantled, a local historian discovered the remains of the ovens. 5 mud structures, weathered but still recognizable, scattered across an empty field in West Texas. She documented them, researched their origin, and eventually pieced together the story of the German women who had built them during the coldest winter.